presentation, but it was a super valuable experience. We just had a hard time getting on the same page, on the same subject, and making it where we needed to go. So I'm Ryan Van Rokel. This is
I'm Darcy Lawson from Notre Dame in Chico.
And I'm Cynthia Smith up in Pine Ridge, Magalia.
so
We all teach 7th grade.
our long-term goal is to increase the ability of students to produce scientific explanation, or to extend that a little bit. We settled on a topic area around biodiversity because we were all coming off of some sort of a genetics unit and headed into biodiversity. So 7th grade level for all of us. And then what the expectation of the students in the end was to analyze data and use that CER framework to write scientific explanations in response to the essential question of how has biodiversity on Earth changed over time. So we used this curriculum came out of scientific argumentation and biology classroom activities, which I believe is probably more focused on the high school level, but throw it out there, right? So we threw it out there. It's a pretty challenging activity. Let's see what happens. These are kind of meeting the requirements of NGSS. The things that we touched on in this activity. This is more of a reference point if you look through the slideshow later and are kind of wondering about these. So here's a lesson overview. So we sat down, kind of paced this thing out a little bit. We wanted some sort of engage, so we used a slideshow. The kids enter in the room. There was a slideshow running of just a diversity of species, from mushrooms to trees to animals to bacteria, whatever. And and some enchanting music in the background. So we had them just sort of sit and key in on the slideshow for a little bit and talk about what they were seeing. And they came up with a lot of good ideas. They kind of came finally to the conclusion that it was about just all the different life forms on Earth. We watched a short video explaining drivers of biodiversity and what biodiversity was, so that they had that framework to start the activity. We introduced the CER framework. I did the lesson study first, and so I kind of spent some time debriefing with them about what background knowledge they had around that particular question, and they filled that in on the top. So if you want to take just a moment, and then we introduce the question. If you want to take a moment and just sort of look at the data that's in front of you, there's actually there's a table and then there's a graph, and I'd be curious to hear what sort of conclusions you might come through, just a preliminary glance through that data.
And this is pretty much the same thing that we did with our students, is we kind of just opened it up and had them take a look at these numbers, because there was a lot of them, and for a 7th grader, at first it's very overwhelming. And the cool part was they already noticed things very quickly of different trends that you guys will see in there.
So one of the big differences in the settings of where we were doing this, we were working off of a block schedule, so we had a full 2 hours with the kids, so they had a good chunk of time to really analyze the data, and we were able to move around within the groups and sort of listen in on the conversations and give them plenty of time to interact with that data and really push them to find unique ways of dealing with it. As we moved into your classroom, the period was much shorter, a 50-minute period, and to reach the goal of data analysis and sort of some conclusions by the end, it was pretty challenging.
I actually had to take the second day, and it was pretty much the whole period of kids organizing the data, and we'll show how they did that for me.
So then, once they had spent some time with that, we used the 3-box, the CER from the October thing, and had them try to identify evidence. So one of the first red flags went up right away is that though they had interacted with this format a little bit, their idea still of what evidence looks like is a little bit tricky. They go instantly into inferencing and trying to put reasons down and all this stuff, and so like that was one of the red flags that went up right away. Is we probably need to dial this back and really split the lesson into 2 parts, give some more real concrete examples of what evidence looked like, and that was one of the takeaways right away. Then came the interesting opportunity for them to try and get into the reasoning part of this. And this was early in the unit as far as that goes. I think we had all introduced some sort of geologic timeline. They had the genetic background, but we really hadn't put much time into changes over time sort of aspect of this. And so it really was sort of what can you do with this? How does this play out in what you're studying right now? So they went into that. We got some coaching in on that, and they came to have a filled out graphic organizer. Then the students the next day, actually that day they spent time producing a rough draft of the scientific explanation. A lot of them used the frames, some of them didn't, and it was quite clear to see which students were actually accessing the frames and which weren't as far as organization goes. Then the next day, the students were with their peer group, so they were in groups of about 4 students. We moved them whole group from place to place to look at other kids' document and comment on it. So they had the rubric that comes with, which you'll see in a minute, that comes with this, and try to evaluate other kids' scientific explanations. They had to comment, there had to be a good comment, there had to be some suggestions for improvement, and they had to try and use the rubric to score that. I'll tell you, the scoring was wildly different. Okay, so right away it was like red flag number 2. There's no common reference points for what this looks like in a great way. Okay, and so or a bad way or whatever. And then based on those, they had to do 2 peer groups, and then based on those, they did a revision on that and then submitted that. And I kind of went through those and looked at them for how much change had happened from the first one to the second one. Anything you want to add?
For me, the way I used the rubric was not everybody was finished at the same time, so that part was a bit difficult because the students who were done were able to do more of the peer evaluation than the other students. I have a pretty big range of IEP students and general ed students together, so it was interesting trying to get the peer evaluations done.
So after the initial lesson study, it was clear that these students actually needed concrete instruction in how to actually analyze a data set. So one of our big takeaways or our big discussions around this was, what's some concrete instruction that we can give them in approaching this data set so that they're analyzing it in multiple ways. And it's a sort of scaffold for students who are just not used to looking at data sets. And so here's just a myriad of ways you could do that. We also talked about them building a large graph, probably using Sheets or some other graphing program, using multiple colored lines on there so that they can start to, for some kids who are really visual and not numeric, they would be able to see some trends in there and common features.
And this is what I did that next day after we talked.
So, examples of explanations, they're pretty good. We had some really good ones. One of the things that we found, one of the big discussions we also had was, is this realistic that we can expect really strong scientific explanations out of students who are really hitting this at the beginning of the unit, right? And so the reasoning part of the CER had turned into an inferencing part. They're just guessing, they're just throwing out their ideas, any particular thing that they had that might be there. We tried to push them in certain directions or try to get them to think about something that they already knew. But they ended up pretty strong, some of the groups, and some of the groups are just, they all, though, I think that was one of our successes, they all found some sort of trends in there. So these are up there. If you go to you can just kind of read through those and kind of see. So another thing is, here's the rubric, right? So this rubric it has really no, it's broken into parts, but it has no real descriptors of quality. So that was one of the reasons I think that there was just wildly variable scores from group to group. Obviously, we have to go back and spend more time with this, probably just using the student examples that we just created, right? What does that look like? Probably expanding this a little bit so that as they use this in the future, it becomes more valuable. There's a long list here. We used a lot of the scaffolding materials that were provided from the CER. The grouping strategies. Before they did go back and do their revisions and their peer evaluations, I did use one exemplar in the rubric to try and get them looking for some of the things that should be in a good exemplar. Observable results. So we were happy, the students were clearly able to find evidence of change in the data sets. As you can see, it's pretty obvious in some ways, and then there are some subtleties in others. They found trends in common times, so they started looking crossways as well as just not vertically in there and finding common times, and those are some of our major extinction events that happened over the course of geologic history. They were able to use the graphic organizer, though I would say one of the tricks about using this is that they want to fill in all the bubbles, and maybe they didn't need to in this particular case, right? And so that's one of the things about having 3 boxes, is it pushes them to find 3 things when maybe it would have been okay just to find one thing and be able to justify it, right? They have a hard time identifying the theories related to it, but they did have skills at inferencing and bringing whatever knowledge they had to the table. And working in the groups was a really great part of that because everybody brought some different stuff. Yeah. A lot of the discussions came around that sort of the reasoning part and scientific explanation. So one of the big takeaways was maybe we use this as this activity provides you with you use it early and it provides you with a framework that you then build upon as you go through the unit, and it ends up becoming a post-assessment again at the end. Or maybe this activity becomes a post-assessment at the end after they've been through a lot of content that they could use as the reasoning resource. We got a lot of discussions about how much information, how much did their CER really need to count? Were we digging for too much when it should just be an obvious thing and leave it at that, right? Sequencing of the overall unit and where this plays. A lot of the same challenges, I think, that have already been identified.
Formatting the question was really important
Oh, yeah.
because the original question was, how did it change? And they were all trying to think of a theory that would explain the changes rather than how did that data actually change. So we left out the word how in the second class.
Yeah.
And did that help with their explanation?
Yeah, it
A lot.
did.
Yeah.
It did. It changed their focus. So they weren't focusing on the why yet, they were focusing on
Just look at
what,
that data.
just look at the data. And the way I showed it to them is, because they all said yes, you know, they already knew that. But I said, well, as scientists, we need to prove that. So that's your goal, is to prove how it has changed.
I think our overall goal for production of scientific explanations, it actually has improved, and it's improved just through repeated experience with the framework, because they're actually thinking about the because statement and trying to bring more into their scientific explanations, even if they're not as extensive yet or
And
whatever.
for me, after watching what happened there, I went back to my classroom and I simplified it so that they had a question, and it wasn't on this topic, it was even in a different class. But to answer the question, they made it quick, the answer to the question. And then they had to say, well, why does the evidence tell you that's so? And then from there, well, then explain how this evidence tells you that that's your point. And that was much easier for them to understand than the whole graphic organizer, just to slide through it very simply. And maybe come up with something else the second time around. But the first time around, I think it made it easier for them to see. So that was really helpful for me to be an observer in both classes and to take that away.
So we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next group. You guys shared this in the folder though.
That's okay.
I had a little different group. I was originally going to be with the previous group. However, just scheduling and things didn't work out. So Bev and I worked with my student teacher on a lesson to work with a lesson study. So kind of, I feel like lesson study also is something you do with your student teachers anyway, you know what I'm saying? So it just worked out. The long-term goal was to really focus on problem-solving skills and collaborative group interactions. We did this with my 6th grade class, so they're primarily earth science. The topic area was engineering design, sort of focused around the idea of earthquakes and how we measure seismic waves. Really, it was more on seismic waves, and that was kind of the preceding lesson that we did. Students, basically, they designed a working seismograph to measure the intensity of different types of seismic waves. So, really interactive, kind of the actual lesson we were really focusing on was really sort of a STEM engineering type activity. So, this is sort of the sequence of the 5E sequence, at least, that we did with this unit or this lesson. They engaged. We showed a movie showing a pretty destructive earthquake and discussed what's going on with the earth during that, and during this clip, and how that relates to the movement of seismic waves and activity in the earth. After that, we did a lab, a little individual lab where they used the Slinky to kind of show the movement of different types of seismic waves and how when you change those, what that does to the crust. We took that, and our students all have Chromebooks, so we used their Chromebooks and textbooks to make a reference page in their science notebook, kind of explaining the difference between types of seismic waves and their effects on Earth. And so really this was kind of our elaborate, the building of the seismograph was the elaborate area of the lesson. So they actually got to build a working model to measure seismic waves, and then to wrap it up, we had them compile information and do like a lab report, kind of an explanation of how these things built into their understanding. Some of the outcomes, students working collaboratively to accomplish a goal, as has been discussed in many of the previous presentations. Sometimes that collaboration and the right mix can make an activity really successful or not. Learn how to construct a working scale model of a seismograph with limited materials. Looking back on the revisions of this lesson, the materials and the types of materials they used became a problem, so that's one of the revisions I'll talk about. And the other part was relating the marks on the paper that their seismograph made to the marks on the real seismograph and the records of P and S waves. What makes this mark? Why does it look different than this mark? And kind of relating that to the different types of waves. So one of the things that I think was really important that we did before this was making sure they really understood the different seismic waves and the directions and the movements of those, you know. So this Linky activity was sort of a key activity before this for them to really make sure they understood and could visualize that movement and then translate that to sort of this thing they were going to make and how they could show that using their model. So a lot of this, you know, looking at some of the cross-cutting concepts, it's focused around engineering design was just sort of our, like Stan said before, our vehicle for what we wanted them to do and work on, but they had a lot of other areas, you know, scale and building a model and explaining things from that model. So lots of things were worked on. Here's some pictures. There was some we allowed the students to bring materials, which again, it's going to be one of the revisions I think I have later in my thing. So there's lots of very creative designs. Some of them, my student teacher did build an actual model to kind of share with them at first before they even knew they were going to be building one. And so some of them were modeled directly after her model, which I think sometimes is a negative of showing them one. But this one, for example, was completely different. Her model was similar to the cereal box one. Some of our students were very creative. One of my students in particular cleaned out, I think, her dad's tackle box and brought every type of weight and thing that she could, and then tried to add every single thing to her seismograph. I think just, I don't know why. But she tried to add everything. So kind of, I guess, skipping ahead if I'm going to talk about, I have it later in the slides, but instead of allowing them to bring things in, I probably would do more limited supplies. Because although cool and exciting and they get to think of ways to incorporate other things, a lot of times we noticed got them away from what this thing was supposed to do, and relating that to the original concept of seismic activity and how this is going to measure that. So all the lures and crazy weights that she brought ended up, I actually don't know if we have a picture of that on here, but they were part of it. They also didn't finish theirs because of that. So successes, all groups in the end created a working seismograph. They worked collaboratively for most parts of the activity. There was the whole thing, even with us as teachers working collaboratively, sometimes their ideas didn't get used, and there was some whining about that, but they're sixth graders. The activity generated high interest in earthquakes, so we spent a lot of time after talking and looking at this, talking about Chico State, and some of the students had been to, can't think of the Paul, physical science building and seen that there, so they were very excited about it. Challenges, keeping them focused on the problem they were trying to solve. So not just building a really cool looking model or fancy, but actually what is it supposed to do? What is the form and function of this thing? Helping them understand the planning and revision portions of the engineering design method. So we planned, they sketched, and then a lot of times they just went with that first sketch and didn't really think about that, how they could make that better by revising it and using other ideas. So that took a little bit of time. And then creating measurable by fake earthquakes using a standardized manner. So having them decide what movements that they would basically shake their table or drop something on their table would generate the right type of, or the right intensity of wave for them to measure. So that was a little challenging at first. So were the long-term goals met? So fostering problem-solving skills and a collaborative group interactions. I think that for the most part, we got them to work collaboratively. It was a challenge. Like I said, back to that form and function of the actual seismograph and making it do what it's intended to do. They worked well together. Some groups, like I said, mix the cause and effect area of that design. So revisions, limit the materials definitely so they don't clean out the shed and bring all their stuff to build this. So probably I also would not, I don't know if I put this on here or not, I would not show them the model, the original model, because I think that most of them followed the cereal box model. So I think maybe they could have been more creative if they didn't get stuck in that, kind of like the, you have to present a slides thing, they got stuck in that. So that may have been a little bit more creativity. And then the third, have students standardize that level of shaking or faux earthquake, intensity level so they could show the difference between the patterns that the paper was actually, or the seismograph was actually putting on the paper. I think I've through these. I feel like I'm going very fast. Sorry. I'm sure you don't have questions, don't mind. So a big part that we worked on, the student teacher and Bev and I worked on, was really focusing back again to what is the goal? What are we trying to get the students to understand about this? Not only the engineering design process, but what is making this model create this, outcome or the end result. So working on ways to really get them to think that way is the thing we spent the most time revising and talking about. So assessment-wise, another thing that we did that I forgot to mention is we had them then take their the paper from their seismograph and label which of the marks would be more reflective of like a P wave or an S wave or whatever. So they had to then turn that in, and along with their lab write-up about it. So that's what we did. Do you have any questions?
Is this the first time you've had them build seismographs?
Yes.
And would you do it again?
I would do it again with limited resources. It was very,
It
it was
looks
fun,
cool.
engaging. They had lots of ideas, in particular how to record the movement.
Would you show them a model or a video that shows real seismographic work and then say, now you're making one?
I think I would, yeah, definitely more real connections to a real one would have helped.
The paper, were you having the paper moved as the,
Yeah.
was someone pulling the paper?
It was different, everyone. One group made a little toilet paper roll thing that they had somehow made it roll. One of them, the students were a lot of them, they were just pulling it. And that, again, was kind of unique depending on the group. But again, one of those projects you could do with the junk drawer of stuff as well. It's low cost.
Really cute.
Thank you.
Okay, it is lunchtime, and you guys